I found out at my father's funeral that I had a brother. He'd hidden for 31 years. He was sitting in the front row. There are moments in life that split time clean in two, before and after. The moment you learn something that cannot be unlearned, that reaches backward and rewrites every memory you have in a language you didn't know you were speaking. I am Meredith. I am 34 years old, and the moment that split my life happened at my father's funeral, in the second row of a church I had attended my entire childhood. When I looked across the aisle at a man I had never seen before, and watched my mother's face go the particular color of someone who has been holding a secret for 31 years and has just watched it walk through a door. She knew him. That much was immediately, unmistakably clear. And he knew her. And neither of them had known the other would be there. What I did not yet know, what I would spend the next 8 months finding out, was that the man sitting across from me in the second pew of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, with my father's jaw and my father's hands in the exact particular way my father used to hold himself very still when he was trying not to show what he was feeling, was my brother, my father's son. 31 years old, raised by his mother in a city 2 hours north of the one where I had grown up believing I was an only child. My father had kept him a secret for his entire life, and my mother had known. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the truths that were buried with careful intention have a way of standing up at the worst possible moment and introducing themselves. If you've ever looked at a photograph from your childhood and wondered what else was in the room that the camera didn't catch, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And subscribe, because this story has layers I am still, even now, processing. Let me take you back to the Tuesday morning when my father died, and a stranger sat down in our family's church and changed everything I thought I knew about who I came from. My father's name was Douglas. He was 63 when he died, which is young enough to still feel unfair and old enough that it wasn't entirely unexpected. He'd had a heart issue for 4 years, managed it with medication and careful living, and the stubborn optimism of a man who genuinely believed that if you didn't talk about something, it couldn't fully exist. He died on a Tuesday in the cardiac unit of a hospital 12 minutes from the house he'd lived in for 30 years, with my mother holding one hand and a nurse holding the other because I had stepped out to call my husband and had not made it back in time. That is the part I have made my peace with, mostly. The part I have not entirely made my peace with is everything I would learn in the weeks after, about the man I had spent 34 years believing I knew completely. Douglas was an architect. Not a famous one, not the kind who gets photographed for magazines, but a serious one. The kind who had opinions about load-bearing walls and spent Saturday mornings in bookstores looking at monographs of buildings he would never visit. He designed residential projects and the occasional small commercial space, and he was known in our town as someone who listened carefully and built things that lasted. He coached my soccer team when I was 9 and forgot to keep score. He made pancakes every Sunday in the specific shape of animals, badly, and never improved because he didn't see the point of improving at things you did for fun. He was present in the particular way that good fathers are present. Not perfectly, not without distraction, but genuinely, consistently with the quality of attention that makes a child feel like they are the thing that matters most in the room. I loved him the way you love something you have never thought to question, which is the deepest and also the most fragile kind of love there is. The funeral was on a Friday. I had spent 3 days managing logistics the way grief sometimes expresses itself through action, through phone calls and catering decisions, and the particular torture of choosing which photographs to display on the board by the entrance. My mother, whose name is Patricia, moved through those 3 days in a state of compressed stillness that I recognized as her version of holding herself together. Patricia is not a woman who falls apart visibly. She is the kind of woman who, in a crisis, becomes extremely organized and slightly unreachable, and you don't realize until later that the organization was a structure she was building around something she couldn't let anyone see. I did not understand in those 3 days what it was she was containing. The church filled slowly on Friday morning. Our family is not large. Douglas had been an only child, his parents long gone, and Patricia's family was scattered and not close. But Douglas had been known in the community for 30 years, and the pews filled with the quiet mix of colleagues and neighbors and former clients that accumulates around a person who has lived in one place long enough. I sat in the front row with my mother and my husband, Daniel, who held my hand with the steady, undemonstrative warmth that had made me choose him and has made me grateful for that choice every day since. I noticed the man in the second row across the aisle perhaps 20 minutes before the service began. I noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't fully compute before your mind has the category to put it in. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little older, dressed in a dark suit that fit well and looked like it had been purchased recently. He was alone. He was sitting with a stillness that felt deliberate, the way people sit when they are working hard at appearing natural. He had dark hair like my father's hair had been before it went gray. He had broad hands resting on his knees. And when he turned his head slightly to look at the order of service he was holding, I saw his profile and felt a small particular jolt that I could not immediately explain. I looked at my mother. She was looking at him, and her face had done something I had no name for. The service passed the way funerals pass when you are in them. In fragments, in the spaces between things, in the particular altered quality of attention that grief produces, where some moments are crystalline and others are completely gone. I don't remember the homily. I remember the smell of the lilies. I remember Daniel's thumb moving in small circles on the back of my hand. I remember a reading my father had chosen years ago that my mother had found in a file labeled, in his handwriting, for when this is needed. And I remember the way the room went very quiet when she read it. What I also remember, with complete clarity, is watching my mother walk down the aisle after the service and come face to face with a man from the second pew. I was 4 steps behind her. I watched it happen. He said something to her quietly. His body was careful, uncertain, not aggressive, not accusatory, just present, in the way of someone who has traveled somewhere and has not yet decided whether the traveling was the right decision. My mother said something back. Her voice was too low for me to catch. Her hand came up, a small arresting gesture, and then she looked over her shoulder and saw me watching. The look on her face in that moment is one I will spend a long time describing inadequately. It was the face of a woman at the exact junction between a secret and its ending. I did not get to speak to him at the church. My mother steered me gently toward the reception, toward the people who needed greeting, toward the casseroles and the condolences and the careful machinery of a funeral that continues past the service. She did it without force and without explanation, and with the quiet expertise of a woman who has been managing information her entire life. I let her, because it was my father's funeral and I was not ready to understand what I was seeing. But I did not forget. 2 days later, when the relatives had left and the food was running out, and the house had that particular emptiness that settles in after grief's first formal rituals, I sat across from my mother at the kitchen table and asked her who he was. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. She was quiet for long enough that I could hear the refrigerator. Then she said, "His name is Caleb. He's your father's son." I want to tell you that there was a long, dramatic silence. There wasn't. What there was a strange acceleration of comprehension, the way a pattern resolves suddenly from noise. The jaw, the hands, the stillness, the profile. All of it clicking into place so fast that it felt less like learning something new than like recognizing something I had always been looking at from the wrong angle. I said, "How old is he?" 31, she said. I was 3 when he was born. I did the arithmetic instantly, uselessly. I was 3 years old and my father had another child somewhere, and I had grown up never knowing. Does he... I started, and stopped, and started differently. Did he know about us? He knew about your father, my mother said. He knew Douglas was his father. His mother told him when he was 18. And me, I said. Did he know about me? She looked at her coffee. I don't know what he knows, she said. Which told me she had never asked. Which told me she had been hoping, for perhaps 13 years since Caleb turned 18 and found out who his father was, that he would absorb the information quietly, and never appear. Which told me my mother had been living in a particular state of suspended waiting that had ended the moment he walked into St. Andrew's Episcopal Church on a Friday morning in a suit that looked recently purchased and sat down in the second pew. I asked the question I had to ask. Did you know? Before I was born, did you know about him? She was quiet again. No, she said finally. Not until Caleb was 2. His mother called me, and then she told me the rest. Let me pause here, because I know what you're thinking. And I want to be careful with this part, because the story I'm about to tell you involves people I love and people I have had to learn to understand and people I have had to work hard not to reduce to the roles they played in the worst version of events. My father was a good man. That is a true thing. It is also true that he did something that was not good, and both of those things have to live alongside each other in how I understand who he was. My mother told me the following. My father, in the years before I was born and in the first year of my life, had an affair. The woman's name was Sandra. She was an architect, too. They had met at a conference, the specific anonymous context of professional travel that provides its own particular kind of permission to people looking for it. The affair lasted perhaps 2 years. My mother did not know about it. She was home with me, her infant daughter, while my father attended conferences and site visits and the other itinerant obligations of a career in which professional travel has always been ordinary. Sandra became pregnant. My father did not tell my mother. Sandra raised Caleb alone in a city 2 hours north of ours. My father, by my mother's account, and confirmed later by Caleb himself, sent money for years, consistent and undisclosed, quietly redirected from accounts my mother didn't routinely check. He visited twice. Once when Caleb was an infant, once when he was 4. He did not visit again. Sandra eventually married someone else. Caleb grew up with a stepfather who was kind and present and who he called Dad, while knowing somewhere in the private ledger of his own identity that there was another man 2 hours south whose genetic material he carried and who had decided, at some point, that distance was the most manageable form of involvement. Sandra had called my mother when Caleb was 2. My mother had received the call in the kitchen of the house she and my father had bought together, the house I grew up in, while I played in the backyard and my father was supposedly at a site review. She had listened. She had said very little. She had hung up and waited for my father to come home, and she had confronted him, and he had confirmed everything. And then they had spent a month in the specific cold silence of a marriage, negotiating whether it would survive what had just been disclosed to it. It survived. They built something in the wake of it. Careful, repaired, real. I believe that now. They chose each other again, consciously, in full possession of the cost. And that choice lasted 31 more years and produced what I would have described, before the funeral, as a genuinely loving marriage between two people who had found their way through something hard. What they did not do was tell me. What they did not do was tell Caleb that he had a sister. I found his email address through Sandra. I know that sounds simple. It was not simple. It required locating Sandra through an old phone number my mother had kept in the back of an address book she did not know I had found. She'd written it there the day Sandra called, the practical reflex of a woman who writes down every number, even the ones she hopes she'll never need to use again. It required a careful, very carefully written email to a woman who had every reason not to respond to me, explaining who I was and what I was asking, and making clear, as clearly as I knew how, that I was not calling to cause pain or assign blame, but only because I needed to know the person who was, whether anyone had chosen it or not, my brother. Sandra responded in 3 hours. Her email was brief and dignified and contained Caleb's email address and one sentence that I read several times before I understood it. She wrote, "He has wondered about you his entire life." I had to put my phone down after that. I stood in my kitchen for a while, doing nothing, holding the fact of it, that somewhere for 31 years there had been a person who knew I existed and wondered about me while I moved through my days in complete ignorance of his. He had wondered about me. He had grown up knowing there was a sister somewhere, and not knowing whether the sister knew about him, whether the sister had been told and had simply never reached out, whether he was a secret kept from her or a secret she was keeping from him. He had sat in that church, at that funeral, and looked across the aisle at me and known exactly who I was, while I looked back and saw only a stranger who registered in some wordless way as familiar. I wrote to him that night. I deleted 7 drafts. The 8th one I sent. He wrote back in an hour. His email was longer than I expected and more careful, and contained the specific quality of someone who has been composing a version of this message in their head for a very long time. He had grown up knowing Douglas's name. He had known our town. He had, at 18, when Sandra finally told him the full truth, spent several weeks in a library looking up everything publicly available about his biological father. The firm, the projects, the community involvement, the photographs in local newspaper coverage of various civic events. He had found a photo of my father and me at a ribbon-cutting ceremony when I was perhaps 12, standing in front of a community center Douglas had designed, and he had kept a copy of it. Not obsessively, he wrote, not in a way that consumed him, but he had kept it. He had decided, after a lot of thought, to come to the funeral. He had not told anyone he was coming. Not Sandra, not his stepfather, who had died 2 years earlier and whom he had loved, and not me, obviously, since he didn't have a way to reach me and wasn't certain he should. He had driven down on the Friday morning and sat in the back parking lot for 20 minutes before walking in. He had chosen the second pew because he wanted to be able to see. He had not expected my mother to notice him, but he had, on some level, known the possibility existed. He had also not expected me to see what my mother's face did when she registered his presence. That part, he said later, he had not planned for. He had been watching me, he admitted, watching me the whole service, from the second pew across the aisle, in the way you watch someone you have been imagining for a long time and are finally permitted to see in the actual dimensions of a real room. He said I looked like him in a way that was startling. He said when I turned at one point and our eyes almost met before I looked away, he had felt something he didn't have a word for. The closest word he could find, he said, was recognition. Not identification. Not familiarity. Recognition. The way you recognize something you have always been looking for without knowing the shape of it. He wrote, I didn't come to cause a scene. I just needed to be in the room. He was my father, too, in the only way that's technically true even when everything else around it is a mess. I needed to be somewhere that was his. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I wrote back and asked him if he wanted to meet. We met 3 weeks later on a neutral Saturday in a coffee shop that neither of us had an attachment to, in a city roughly equidistant from both of our homes. I told Daniel everything by then. He had known something significant was happening since the funeral and had been patient in the particular way he is patient with me, which is without pressure and with a very steady presence. He offered to come. I said no. This felt like something I needed to do in a specific kind of alone. I arrived first. I chose a table by the window, which was probably instinctive, the need for a clear line of sight. I ordered coffee I didn't drink. I had no plan for what to say when he walked in. I had tried to prepare something, and the preparing had felt false, and I'd abandoned it on the drive down. Some things don't benefit from a script. Some things need to be met without one. And then the door opened, and Caleb walked in, and I watched him scan the room. And when he found me, something happened on his face that I don't have adequate words for. It was recognition, not just visual recognition. Though that too, because we apparently look more alike than either of us expected. Something around the eyes that several people have since commented on. It was a deeper recognition, the kind that travels below conscious processing, that says this is someone I belong to in a way I don't have the language for yet. He sat down. He said, "Hi," in the way people say things when they've been preparing something longer and then the moment arrives and the preparation falls away. I said, "Hi," in the same way. We sat there for a moment. Then I said, "You have our father's hands." He looked at his hands. He said, "I know. I noticed in photographs." He paused. His mother had photographs? My mother did, I said, from the conference where they met. She kept them. I don't know why. She kept a lot of things. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you angry?" At him, no. At him specifically, sitting across from me with his careful posture and his borrowed hands, and a lifetime of wondering that he had carried with a dignity I was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. No, not even close. At what had been done to both of us, yes. A clean and specific anger that I had been sitting with for 3 weeks, and that I had decided before I walked into that coffee shop not to lead with. I told him both things, plainly. He exhaled and said, "I've been angry too, for a long time." And then I stopped being angry and started being just sad. And then I stopped being sad and started being curious. He looked at me. "You're the first person I've met who shares the same thing I'm curious about." "What are you curious about?" I asked. "Who he actually was," Caleb said. "Not the version I built from photographs and conference programs and a story my mother told me at 18. Who he was as a person who knew me. Who he was to you. I want to stop here and ask you something, because if you've been watching for a while, you know this is the part where it gets real. Not the confrontation part, that's coming. But this part, the part where you have to decide what you're going to do with the truth that arrived without asking your permission. Has someone ever hidden a piece of your own story from you? Something that would have changed how you understood yourself, how you understood the people around you, the choices that were made and why? Tell me in the comments, because I read them, and because you are not as alone in this as the silence around it makes it feel. Subscribe so you're here for what comes next, because my mother's reckoning was still ahead, and so was mine with my father's memory. Back to the story. Caleb and I talked for 4 hours in that coffee shop, and then moved to a restaurant next door because neither of us was ready to stop. We talked about Douglas, about who he'd been to me and who he'd been to Sandra, and what Caleb had been told, and what I could fill in from 34 years of having him as a present, attending, genuinely loving father. That last part was the complicated territory, because Caleb had not had that. He had had money and distance and 2 visits that he barely remembered, and a stepfather who had stepped fully into the space Douglas had vacated. He had not had Douglas. I told him about the pancakes shaped like animals, about the soccer team Douglas had coached and the score he didn't keep, about the file labeled for when this is needed that had contained a reading for his own funeral, because he was the kind of man who thought practically about large things, about the way Douglas used to argue with the television during architecture programs, which Caleb apparently had a version of too, a fact that made us both laugh in the specific complicated way of laughter that is also a little like crying. I asked Caleb what he wished had been different. He thought about it seriously, the way I was already learning he thought about most things. Then he said, "I don't wish he'd been a different kind of man, because the man he was to you sounds like someone worth knowing. I just wish I'd been allowed to know him. Even a little. Even badly. I would have taken badly." That sentence did something to me that I am still not sure how to describe accurately. It made my father's choices feel for the first time not just wrong, but wasteful. What Caleb was describing was not a request for something dramatic or demanding. He had been asking for 31 years without being able to ask, for badly, for inconsistently, for the awkward and imperfect version of a connection. And what he had received instead was a policy of clean absence that had been easier for Douglas to maintain than to revisit. I drove home that afternoon and I sat in the driveway for a long time before going inside. My conversation with my mother happened on a Sunday, 6 weeks after the funeral. I had waited because I needed to be clear about what I wanted from it. Not to wound her, not to punish her, but to understand something I couldn't understand without her participation. The question I needed answered was not why Douglas had done what he had done. I had already arrived at a functional understanding of that. The complicated, uncomfortable truth that good people are capable of cowardice in proportion to what the courage would cost them, and that my father had looked at the cost of telling the truth and chosen instead a version of management that lasted 3 decades without ever resolving into honesty. The question I needed answered from my mother was different. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, which is where my mother is most herself. She moves around a kitchen with a purposeful calm that she doesn't always have in other rooms. She was making soup. The particular chicken soup she had made my entire childhood whenever things were hard, which told me she had known this conversation was coming and had been preparing in the way she prepares for difficult things. I sat at the table. She kept her hands moving over the cutting board for a moment, then stopped and turned around and sat down across from me. I told her I had met Caleb. She already knew. I had texted her after our first meeting. Briefly, not unkindly. She had written back with a single sentence. "How is he?" Which told me that even now, even after 31 years of hoping he would remain at a manageable distance, some part of her had been wondering. I told her he was good. I told her he was thoughtful and careful and that he had their father's hands and that he was funnier than I expected. I watched her face do something complicated as I spoke. Then I asked her the question, "Why didn't you tell me?" She was quiet. The soup simmered. She said, "We didn't want to hurt you." That sentence, that specific sentence which I had been expecting and had still, when it arrived, the full weight of. We didn't want to hurt you. As though the choice between truth and hurt had been evaluated carefully, and the protection of my comfort had been placed above my right to know who I was and who I came from. "Mom," I said, "I had a brother for 31 years and I didn't know. I lost the chance to know him as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult. We lost each other for 31 years because you decided I couldn't handle the information." She started to speak. I kept my voice even. "He sat at Dad's funeral and knew who I was, and I didn't know him. That is what the decision to protect me actually cost." She said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I know. Did you ever want to tell me?" She picked up her coffee mug and held it without drinking from it. There was a long quiet. "Yes," she said finally. "When you were 16, I almost told you. And again when you were 22 and had that." She waved her hand vaguely, referring to a year I'd had that had been difficult in ways I'd told her about and some I hadn't. I thought, that year, that it might help you to know you weren't entirely alone in being outside your father's perfect picture of himself. That sentence was honest in a way I hadn't been expecting. I let it sit. "You thought it might help me," I said slowly, "but you didn't tell me. Your father asked me not to, and I—" She stopped. She put the mug down. I chose your father over the truth. I thought I was also choosing our family. I understand now that I was choosing the version of the family that was most comfortable for me to live in. That was the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me about this, and she said it looking directly at me, which is not easy for Patricia, who manages difficult things by looking at the middle distance. I told her, I'm not going to pretend this wasn't a loss. It was. It's a real one, and I'm going to keep feeling it for a while. But I'm also not going to let it be the only thing. Because Caleb is here now, and he's mine now, and that part is real too. That part is something we get to build. Her eyes filled. Not performed. Actually filled. I'd like to meet him, she said. If he's willing. I'll ask him, I said. And I meant it. I asked him the following week. He said yes. He said it quickly, like someone who had been hoping to be asked. Here is what the year after the funeral looked like. Caleb and I talked every week, first by text, then by phone, eventually by the video calls that are the modern form of presence for people who live in different cities and are learning each other. Those calls had their own particular rhythm and texture. We talked about our childhoods. I would describe something from growing up with Douglas, and he would listen with a quality of attention that was not painful to watch. Exactly. But that had weight. He wasn't jealous of the soccer team, or the Sunday pancakes, or the presents I had been given, and he had not. He was just collecting information. The way you collect information about someone you want to understand. He asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Questions that made me go back and look at ordinary memories from a new angle. He asked me once whether Douglas had ever seemed preoccupied in a way I couldn't explain. Whether there had been moods I didn't understand as a child. Stretches of quiet that felt different from his normal quiet. I thought about it seriously. I told him yes. There had been Octobers, specifically, that seemed harder for my father than other months. A week or two in October where he was present but slightly elsewhere. Where he'd sit on the porch in the evenings for longer than usual. Where he'd come to dinner and eat without talking much and then go back to his drawing table. I had attributed it to work cycles, to the seasonal rhythm of architectural projects. I had not thought to wonder whether it meant something else. Caleb was born in October. I met Sandra 3 months in. She was gracious in a way that cost her something, I could tell. The specific graciousness of a woman who had raised a child alone while the man responsible was building a life elsewhere, and who had made peace with that over many years, and was now watching her adult son form a relationship with the sister who had existed on the other side of that man's divided life. She shook my hand when we met. We talked for 2 hours. I thanked her for raising him the way she had. She thanked me with some difficulty for reaching out. Caleb met my mother on a Saturday in October. I was present. Daniel was present. My mother had made the chicken soup again, which was either a remarkable coincidence or her unconscious method of signaling that she intended to be honest, and I chose to believe it was the latter. The conversation was difficult in the way that real conversations about real things are difficult. Not loud, not dramatic, but weight-bearing, with long pauses and careful navigation around edges that could still cut. My mother apologized to him. It wasn't a perfect apology, and it didn't resolve anything in a single afternoon. But it was genuine, which is the beginning that matters. Caleb was kind to her. More kind than she had any right to expect. He told her afterward, in a text to me, that he had prepared to feel angrier than he did, and that he wasn't sure whether the anger had simply gone quiet for the afternoon, or whether Patricia had managed to seem genuinely human in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. He said she reminded him, in certain expressions, of Douglas in the photographs. He said that was a strange and not entirely unwelcome thing to notice. I told him, get used to strange and not entirely unwelcome. That's the operating condition for both of us now. He sent back a single laughing emoji and then a long message about a building he was working on. He was in project management, not architecture, but the language he used when he talked about structures sounded like our father, the specific vocabulary of someone who thinks in terms of what things support and what things rest on. And we talked for an hour about his project, and he didn't mention the family conversation again until the end, when he said simply, "She's trying. I can see that. I'll take trying." He had offered that to Douglas, too, once, in a letter. He told me about it months later. He had written Douglas a letter when he was 23, a careful and non-accusatory letter that simply introduced himself and said he wasn't looking for anything dramatic, and that if Douglas ever wanted to know him, he was available. The letter had been sent to the firm's address. Douglas had never responded. Caleb had waited 8 months and then let it go. When he told me this, I was quiet for a while. Then I said, He kept the letter. I found it. In a locked box in his office that my mother had me open after the funeral because she couldn't do it. There was a locksmith involved, actually. The letter was in the box. Your letter. Caleb was silent on the phone for a moment. He kept it, I said. I know that's not the same as responding, I said. No, Caleb said, but it's something. He kept his hand on the edge of the door. He did, I said. He just never opened it the whole way. And I think that was the thing he was most ashamed of in his whole life. I think that was the thing that lived in that locked box and that he opened sometimes when he was alone and then locked back up again. We stayed on the phone without talking for a little while. Sometimes with Caleb, in the years since I found him, the most honest thing we do is just stay on the line. Here is what I understand now that I didn't understand at the beginning. I spent a long time in the months after the funeral trying to hold two versions of my father simultaneously. The one who had been present and loving and there, the man with the pancakes and the soccer team and the file labeled for when this is needed. And the man who had a son he refused to know, who kept a letter in a locked box and never answered it, who chose management over courage for 3 decades and called it protection. I tried to make those two men into one coherent person, and I kept failing at it. Then Caleb said something to me on the phone one evening that rearranged my understanding in a way I haven't been able to undo. He said, I think what's hard is that you want the good version to explain away the bad one. But they're just the same person. Most people who fail the ones they love aren't monsters. They're just people who ran out of courage at a specific and consequential moment and then spent the rest of their lives building around that absence instead of addressing it. He paused. That's not a defense of him. I want to be clear. It's just what I've landed on personally as a way to live with it. I asked, how do you live with it? By not making it the center, he said. By making something else the center. He thought for a moment. You're the something else. For me, you're the center of this story now, not him. Here is the only lesson I will leave you with. And I mean it the way I mean very few things I say. There are truths that families keep because the keeping feels like kindness. Because the disclosure seems too costly, too destabilizing, too hard for everyone involved. And sometimes those families keep those truths for so long that the keeping becomes its own kind of architecture. A structure that the people inside it have arranged their whole lives around, that has its own weight and its own load-bearing assumptions, that has started to feel like the foundation of something rather than what it actually is, which is a wall built around a hole. My father kept a wall around a hole for 31 years. My mother helped him maintain it. And what was inside the hole was not a scandal, not a monster, not a ruin. It was a person. A person who grew up wondering. A person who wrote one careful letter and waited 8 months for an answer that never came. A person who drove down on a Friday morning and sat in a church full of strangers and needed to be in a room that had been his father's. Just that. Just to have been in the room. What the wall cost. 31 years of a brother I didn't know I had. What removing the wall made possible. Everything since. Every week of phone calls. Every conversation about buildings and families and the particular strange experience of discovering at 34 that you look at someone and feel the specific recognition of blood. His daughter. He has a daughter, my niece, 14 months old, who has the same thing around the eyes that he and I both have, and that came from Douglas, who will never meet her. She has an aunt now who did not exist before a stranger sat in the second pew of a church on a Friday morning and changed the count of the people I belong to. I am not grateful to my father for what he hid. I am not grateful to my mother for helping him hide it. I am clear-eyed and honest about what those choices cost, and I have said so to both of them, the first without the possibility of response, the second in a kitchen over chicken soup that has become, in the months since, a kind of ritual. The soup means we're going to be honest today. It means Patricia has decided she can afford to be a little more real in a way that took her a long time to find, but that she is genuinely trying to live in now. What I am is lucky. Lucky in the specific way of someone who almost didn't find out. Who might have spent her whole life not knowing. Who might have sat across from Caleb at a different event, somewhere, some year, and felt that wordless, inexplicable recognition and walked away without ever understanding what she'd felt. The wall might have held. He was careful. My father was very good at structures, but a letter in a locked box is a door, even if you never open it. And doors, given enough time, have a way of opening without anyone's permission. His did. On a Friday morning in a church we both had a claim to, in a room full of flowers and grief and the particular suspended quality of funerals where time does something unusual. His did. And I am standing on the other side of it, in a life that is larger and more complicated and more real and more mine than the one I woke up in that Tuesday morning when the hospital called and the world divided itself into before and after. That's my story. A locked box. A second pew. A letter that waited 11 years for someone to find it. And a brother who drove 2 hours and sat in the room because some forms of belonging survive every decision made against them. If you needed to hear today that the truth has its own timeline and cannot be permanently contained, take that. Take it with you. Share this with someone who's been kept at the edge of a story that was always theirs to know. Leave a comment. Subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge, and I'll see you in the next one.